My interest, you know, when you went to this group, and their main definition for being part of this group is menstruation.
Yeah.
How do they go if someone who has had a sex change, if a man has had a sex change?
I was wondering, a question that did pop into mind is, does that guy identify as non-binary or something like that?
It's a good question, and I asked the gender question. You'll see.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Okay,
I said,
so you haven't actually
in our culture where there are multiple gender identities, given that gender is a construct, social construct, there you go, there's a conversation for you. How do they respond to people who may be outwardly male but identify in gender as non-binary or as, or who in fact are intersex?
Yeah, yeah.
How do they go with that? And there was real loving generosity towards the whole gender question and so on and so forth. But their particular form of spirituality is profoundly related to the women's cycle, and that's just the way it is. So,
so I don't know.
okay.
And that's fine. I had no issues with that.
But it's a good question to ask.
But
Absolutely.
with someone who
Yeah.
did have issues with that.
Yeah. And they're the kinds of questions that you can ask the people that you interview, you know, and that you go and be with. You can just push them on those sorts of questions, and because they're the kinds of questions that come up for spiritual carers in hospitals and you know, various different places. So, yeah. I'll just wait for another couple of minutes.
I know, right? So when they're actually gone through menopause, what happened?
Yeah, so there's pre.
Well, Hayley wouldn't be menopausal. I mean, as in, it would be,
No, but she would be
pre-menstrual.
Menstrual.
I was gonna say.
Did you get a sense, Chris, as well, that there was a male equivalent sort of, like, this is in our community, this is the sacred space and place for the women, and the men have something else?
Yeah, they were talking about how they would accommodate the men who were part of their relational sphere and journey and so on, and that would be a separate group.
There's no actual organised male group that would reflect similar values to this group.
There would be, particularly in Europe. There are strong groups related to ancient Druidism and Earth religion, Earth spirituality, Celtic spiritualities, and so on that are very open to men. Yeah, they're multi-gender and and they're, you know, they're often identified by the major religions as occultish kind of communities, and characterised in classical terms as occultish devil worshippers and so on. In essence, they are really just what dominant religious narratives have called pagan, which means pre-colonial. Before the dominant Western European and Eastern European religions colonised the known world, there were religions everywhere. And they were classified as pagan because they didn't conform to the dominant religion. And usually they were characterised by a very close sense of the rhythms of the earth, patterns of seasons and food gathering and life cycle and so on. Very, very deeply connected. Whereas the Western traditions, Western European traditions, grew increasingly transcendent and cerebral in response. So, you know, I mean, I grew up with the narrative that, what's it called? I've just lost the word. Religions where spirit inhabits things.
Pantheism, no.
No. Why have I lost the word? It'll come back to me a bit later. But those kinds of religions were seen in my childhood as very, very suspect and to be critiqued by the Christian religion and changed. People, a lot of people were converted from those kinds of religions, and that's just the way we thought, and many of us still think. So, working out how you hold that stuff and still listen is really important. I thought we'd spend a little bit of time. Beth is going to come at some stage, so she'll come in and I'll introduce her then. I thought we'd spend a little bit of time looking at approaches to spirituality and my thinking about spirituality and spiritual care in the sense that I'm about to present to you really began in the midst of my encounters with trauma in a multi-faith, multicultural environment. And trauma is such a profoundly physiological thing. Traumatic events, abusive events that cause post-traumatic stress and so on actually alter our neural responses to the world. And you can try and talk someone out of it until you're blue in the face. But if the body has set up certain neural pathways that it's very difficult to alter, then it requires a response that is bodily, that's organic. And so I began to ask the question, well, what does spirituality mean in that context? When you're dealing with bodies, with organisms, where there's no, less and less in my thinking and my experience was I able to create a binary demarcation between body and spirit. And in fact, the more I looked into it, that binary thing is actually not that Christian. It's very early Greek, the dualism between body and spirit. But in actual fact, when you look into the Christian tradition, which is my own tradition, the kind of immortality of the soul that characterises a lot of Christian narrative is not actually Christian. It's early Greek, and not making any value judgments on that, it's just a thing. Christians actually, in the early days, were wrestling with this question, and you can even see that in the New Testament. There's wrestlings between what is uniquely a Jesus way of thinking about the world and how does that mix with Greek philosophy, which was so prevalent in the Hellenistic world. What do we take with us that's good from Greek philosophy? What do we let go of? And there was the whole question of whether the Gnostic cults and so on were actually genuine expressions of the Christian religion, and they were very dualistic. So the Gnostic cults generally taught that the Spirit of God left Jesus just before he died, because you couldn't have pure spirit mixed up with base bodily death. That those things just didn't seem to fit in the early Greek mind. Christians rejected Gnosticism by and large, and in so doing actually rejected the idea that when the body dies, the soul lives on in immortal endurance. That's not something that Christians traditionally believe in. That might come as a surprise to you, I don't know, because a lot of us have had that as part of our narrative. In fact, what Christians believe in is bodily resurrection. That has been a profoundly important insistence of the Christian tradition, that life is always embodied, it's attached to living cells, and that when the Christian dies, they are thrown on the mercy of the Creator, the living God, the source of life, And that one is the one who will, they hope and believe, resurrect them, bodily resurrect them. So, how do I get onto this? Oh, that's right, spirituality. And so I wrestled more and more with this as I sought to understand how I could be authentically present to the spirituality of people who believe differently to me, particularly those who required attention to organic healing, physical healing. And Bessel van der Kolk, who many of you will know and love, or hate, I don't know, was a great sort of inroad for me into understanding how spirituality and trauma and body can all be understood sort of in the same space. And even more than Bessel van der Kolk, Antonio Damasio, and you may also have bumped, if you've read Van der Kolk, you will have bumped into this guy. Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist, and I should also mention his wife, Hannah Damasio, who is also a neuroscientist, and they work as a team. She does all the raw science, all the scanning and gathering of data, and they work with people who have various brain lesions or injuries and so on, and they map changes in behaviour and so on. And they've done a lot of thinking about what neurophysiology means for the human person. And the two books that I recommend that you read are The Feeling of What Happens, Body, Emotion, and the Making of Consciousness. This stuff's eminently readable. It's science, but it's written for us. Some of you may be scientists. Any scientists? We're all scientists in a sense.
What's the name of that again?
The Feeling of What Happens, Body, Emotion, and the Making of Consciousness. And somewhat intriguingly titled Looking for Spinoza. Do you know who Spinoza was? Yeah? Philosopher, one of the early rationalist philosophers. Wrote a lot about emotions, surprisingly. Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow, and the Feeling Brain. This is really interesting work because Antonio Damasio is profoundly open to the idea of human spirit and spirituality. He talks about it differently than the way most religious traditions would. He sees it as a physiological reality, part of our core consciousness. And he writes a lot about that. So I use a lot from him in my thinking about what human spirituality is. Now remember, my core pursuit in this inquiry is how can I understand every human person who comes to me as intrinsically spiritual, rather than, oh, you're a Christian, so you're spiritual. You're an atheist, so you're not. Most atheists will say, I'm not spiritual. Okay, so how do I understand that? You're this, you're that. How do I actually be present to the people in my care in a way that is able to perceive their reality as profoundly spiritual? And one of the first bases, of course, is etymology. What is the meaning of the word spirit? Does anyone know? It comes to our tradition from the Hebrew tradition and from the Greek tradition and the Latin tradition.
It's not breath.
Breath. Breath. That's what spirit means. In Hebrew, ruach. Doesn't it? I love that word.
Yeah.
Ruach. And variously in the creation narratives of the Hebrew Bible, the Spirit of God hovered above the waters, the Ruach of God. The wind of God is sometimes translated. What it means is the life of God, the animation, the animating spirit, that which gives life. And so right at the core of the Hebrew tradition and the Jewish tradition is this idea that God is actually life itself. God is the ground of all being, the ground of all living things. That's what we mean when we say God. So that leads us to ask the question of, well, does that mean that all things, by virtue of the fact that they are alive, or participate in the cycle of life, even if they're inanimate objects, are all of these things innately spiritual. And so I decided to propose that to myself as a hypothesis. That all things by virtue of their existence are living. And you say, oh no, hang on, you can't equate, the world with God, that's pantheism, and that's heresy. And we have to pay attention to those questions. I don't think I want to say that all matter equals God, because I want to be able to say that actually life is able to transcend itself in newness and novelty, which means I want to say that God is growing and living and not just sort of static matter. But even that growing and living novelty in creation is intrinsic to what life means. So you can sort of see the way my pattern was going. And so I began to explore Damasio's understanding of spirit. And essentially, Damasio's understanding of spirit is that it is that cohesive centre in the human organism, and he uses the word organism to mean brain, neurovascular system, musculoskeletal system, all of the neuro signalling systems and so on, so he doesn't separate brain from body, as we often do. All of these systems that go to make up our organism have this, and he calls it mysterious, centre that has the capacity to run a check. Body scan, brain to toes, and the central question that our organism is constantly asking, in a pre-conscious sense, we don't think about it, is, how am I? How am I? How is this in relation to its environment? And what he's talking about is homeostatic regulation. Do you know about homeostatic regulation? The idea that there is a narrow set of conditions under which it is possible to be alive, internally and externally. And we as organisms are beautifully evolved, or beautifully created, however you want to think about it, to regulate our inner and our outer environment in a way that helps us to stay alive. Homeostatic regulation. Homeostasis means being able to change in order to stay the same. Can you think of an example, simple example of how we do this every day, every moment?
Adapting to getting our temperature right.
Right. So there's a certain temperature range within which it's possible for my organism, me as an organism, to stay alive. What happens if it gets too hot? Starts to get to the hotter end of the possible living conditions.
Sweat.
Do you decide to sweat? No. You just start to sweat. And you can say, oh, it's just my body. Well, you are your body. So you as an organism make the necessary change in response to a change in your environment. You shift, change. Get too cold? Shiver. If shivering and sweating is not enough, what else can you do?
Blood expansion, contraction,
Right?
rediversion to
Core organs, yep.
Go put a jumper on.
Hypothermia.
Yeah, put a jumper on. Go put a jumper on.
Sorry, go put a
Go
jumper on. Right, so your organic responses to your environment have the capacity to find their way to a part of your brain that is able to reflect and not only regulate your inner environment, but regulate your external environment. Go and put a jumper on, light a fire, jump in the river. Okay, so that's all part of homeostatic regulation. It's inner and outer regulatory activity that's part of who we are. And the way we and the way we receive the information from our environment, Damasio says, is primarily through the experience of emotion and feeling. So he kind of maps it like this, starting right down the bottom with the pre-conscious responses, relatively simple stereotyped patterns of response which include metabolic regulation, reflexes, the biological machinery behind what will become pain and pleasure, drives and motivations. So we don't think about this stuff, it's just happening all the time because there's something about us as organisms that wants to stay alive, even without us thinking about it. So rising up from those very, very simple pre-conscious patterns, we then they form into emotions, complex stereotyped patterns of response which include secondary emotions, primary emotions and background emotions. So these are kind of the core emotions that all human beings have: fear, fright, those sorts of responses, and the kind of warm socialising responses, attachment that enable you to mate and reproduce. It's all part of homeostatic regulation, even though we romanticise it, it's part of the basic human function. So those kinds of emotional responses, but also the emotions that have become part of our organism through our experiences through life. And this is where trauma theory is really, really important, because abuse and trauma can actually shape our physiology in ways that shape our behaviour, and that's why it can be so disruptive to our homeostasis, because we find it difficult to maintain relationships, to breed, to socialise, to live fully in our communities. So we go up from emotion, which is very physical, into feelings just before full consciousness, sensory patterns signalling pain, pleasure, and emotions become images. So we're developing what is implicit in the theatre of the body, the organism, in the theatre of what we might call mind, which includes brain, and it's all part of mind, really, when you think about it this way. And then you have that level of when all of this stuff coalesces into this capacity to self-consciously ask the question, how am I? And which then brings us into the capacity to grasp and shape our external environment, to create an environment within which it's possible to live and flourish and grow. Complex, high reason, complex, flexible and customised plans of response are formulated in conscious images and may be executed as behaviour. So you can kind of see how he's describing the human living organism as this dynamic capacity to claim life, spirit. And he calls it spirit. This is a great quote. The biological function of emotions is twofold. The first function is the production of a specific reaction to the inducing situation, whether it's an external change or an internal change. In an animal, for instance, the reaction may be to run, or to become immobile, or to beat the hell out of the enemy, or to engage in pleasurable behaviour. In humans, the reactions are essentially the same, tempered, one hopes, by higher reason and wisdom. The second biological function of emotion is the regulation of the internal state of the organism, such that it can be prepared for the specific reaction. For example, providing increased blood flow to arteries in the legs so that muscles receive extra oxygen and glucose, in the case of a flight reaction, or changing the heart and breathing rhythms in the case of freezing on the spot. In either case and in other situations, the plan is exquisite and the execution is most reliable. In short, for certain classes of clearly dangerous or clearly valuable stimuli in the internal or external environment, evolution has assembled a matching answer in the form of emotion. What do you think of that? He's drawn it as a tree. He doesn't include high reason there. So this is kind of a neurological, a neuroscience approach to understanding humanness and other living things and all the things that participate in creating the conditions under which life is possible as spirit. And you might say, yeah, but it's a bit reductionist, it just brings it all down to matter or, things or physiology. What's your response to that critique of Damasio?
The response to the critique or the response to the master?
Either.
I guess to just, if you're talking about it in terms of this unit, everybody's the same.
Yeah.
They just might believe in something slightly different.
So, but yeah.
But essentially, every human is the same, and you think about when it's coming close to death, we all have the same emotions.
Yeah.
Particularly, that's when it comes out. We're
Yeah.
all trying to search for that higher being. What's going to happen to us after we die? So approaching the people that we come across are the same as me, essentially.
Yeah.
Which, you think about that with racism and stuff. It's like, well, it doesn't matter that you're African and I'm a New Zealander, that we still function the same.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. So you start to get a sense of the mutuality of living things and the intersection, the way they participate in each other's capacity to stay alive. Because one of the other things we know, of course, is that we can't be alive if other things aren't alive as well. Yeah, so it's all part, and the whole global concern at the moment for ecological health in the world is part of our homeostatic regulation. We sense ourselves reaching the outer levels of what is possible for life to continue, and some of us are trying to adjust, trying to change in order to keep ourselves within our environment, within what's possible to stay alive.
Where does human will and spirit come in?
Yep, say more about what you mean.
So the body wants to ultimately find homeostasis to keep itself alive. What if in spirit you don't want to be alive? Does the body always follow? And then alternatively, what about in illness where the body does the opposite of keeping homeostasis, attacks?
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, the will could be evil.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question.
I was thinking along those lines as well, where being in Canberra, I actually do a lot of work at the Australian War Memorial, and there's a plaque there about the Anzac spirit, and it talks about acts of valour and courage in spite of loss of life. And so there's this, I guess, as I've been thinking about what you're talking, there's this sense of, on one hand, the spirit as the drive to maintain life, and yet sometimes people recognise what they might label as an extraordinarily spiritual act, and in our culture, the acts of the Anzac spirit, that is so profound because it actually gives up. Like it runs counter to that instinctive stay alive.
Yep.
So I guess that I haven't quite got a formula, but there's something about me that says I resonate with the idea that there's this life-driving endeavour, but sometimes even in our own language, when we can spot the spiritual somehow because it's contrary to a life-driving endeavour. In fact, it's sacrificial.
Yeah.
In that, yeah. So that's kind of.
So the question that might be asked of that is, what is the underlying concern of the soldier who's prepared to sacrifice their own individual organism for what?
For the greater, that's what I was thinking you're talking about. It's like he might be sacrificing his life, but he knows he's saving 1,000 others back in his country. So that's what's driving. So it's still about the organism.
So it's
isn't it?
still about a concern for life. Life itself. Maybe my particular expression of life is worth sacrificing if I know that ultimately my family are going to be able to keep living and breeding and continuing. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what's driving the concern? I think a more complicated question is actually, what about suicide?
Yeah.
What about suicidal ideation? When the psychology of the human person somehow gets into a pattern of thinking or self-understanding or feeling or emoting that suggests that it is more conducive to life for me to finish myself. And that's, I think that's a really difficult one to understand in light of this perspective. But I would want to have a really good, solid, critical discussion about what is ultimately driving suicidal ideation. And it's actually moving into the more, this is a bit caricaturish, there are all kinds of things obviously that drive it. But I would want to talk about the existential side of this stuff. To what extent is the construction of meaning as a function of human life and flourishing part of that this homeostatic process? Can we divorce the higher functions of reason that Damasio has talked about there, which include meaning making and existential questioning and intersubjective transcendence, all of those parts of what it means to be a human being? Can they be divorced from homeostatic regulation? I think he would argue that ultimately they're all rooted in it, even though because they're so highly developed and self-reflective, they seem to be disembodied in that sense. He would argue that they're not, and that would be a question that we'd have to debate. Ruth, you're just about jumping out of your skin.
No, I'm not sure I'm not exactly sure it fits in, but if you see immune responses up there and, the comprehension of when a person experiences trauma, all this fear, anxiety, the body responds with an immune response. And that is, we release adrenaline, noradrenaline, catechol, so these cytokines. And so generally the body can cope with that if it's just a fright and flight and your body then settles down. But if you have a constant impact of those things, I mean, everyone who's done counselling should understand this, and the impact of the cytokines on the body. And if your receptors in the body are full of cytokines and there's still more running around, they actually impact the neurotransmitters. So that actually impacts how you think, which it takes it away from a conscious decision. So depression, those things are related to that fact that the neurotransmitters are impacted, and that is sometimes, that is not necessarily a choice.
Yeah.
It's because of
That's very helpful.
happened, you see. So that's where, as I said, that's where that immune response actually takes away. So, this separation of physical and mental shouldn't never be there, because it's all still physical. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And
Damasio says we're used to thinking of the brain as the sort of controller of the body. It's all controlled by up here. That's a very Western idea, but that's the way we think. He said, in actual fact, what we're learning is that the brain is the captive audience of the body. The brain responds to what the whole organism is attempting to do in response to its environment. But that's really, really helpful. Can I just pause here and we'll say something a little bit about what we're doing, or what I'm doing, what I'm explaining to you in my own process. I consider myself to be a reflective practitioner, which is the same as saying I'm a pastoral theologian. I actually don't think there's much difference between those, except that I ground my reflective practice within my faith tradition. Action, this is a cycle, this is called praxis. Praxis doesn't mean practice, it means a continual cycle of reflective activity. And you could say experience here with action. In fact, in this unit, it's more in the sense of experience. We're going to go out and have some experiences, and then we're going to reflect. Well, for me, it was both of these together at Sanctuary. I had the experience of trauma, multi-faith, etc., that led me to ask. Okay, so I'm out there in my work, I'm providing spiritual care. It's throwing up all kinds of questions for me. Because it's what I do, I take those away and I reflect. And this is where theological reflection comes in. Just get this stuff out of the way. Before, traditionally, the 4 sources of theological reflection, does anyone know what they are?
Scripture,
Yeah, scripture or text,
experience,
experience,
tradition.
tradition, you've done pretty well so far. Shall I give it to you?
Yes.
Reason. Now, yeah, we would say, some of us would say scripture. If you've got a secular spiritual carer who is not a Christian, it may be a Muslim, they would use their sacred text. That's why I often use sacred text, so that I can be inclusive of everyone I'm teaching. If you're an atheist, you might use Epicurus, one of the early Greek philosophers, who had a philosophy of human flourishing and well-being, and the principles of his philosophy are still present in our Christian tradition and other traditions today. So what we've done so far is we've looked at experience, and we've looked at reason. Do you know what reason means? It's not just rationality. We sometimes equate reason with rational thinking, deductive thinking. That's part of it. But I like Paul Tillich's view of it, which is basically any human capacity that enables us to grasp and shape reality. So that includes rationality, but it also includes imagination. It includes all of our senses, includes our creativity. So it's all part of our reasoning ability. Got to recognise too that Damasio stands in a tradition. Might not be necessarily the Christian tradition, but it's a scientific tradition that's very much related to the development of Western thought and Christianity's been very closely aligned with that. So we're starting to draw on all of these I am in my reflection on what it means, what spirituality means. This is what you'll be expected to do in response to your experience. Okay, so be thinking about that. We'll talk about that shortly. Okay, so that's Damasio. My next question was, is there anything kind of similar to this in the Christian tradition for me that I can draw on to give some sort of weight to my theological reflection? And once again, if I was from another tradition, I might ask the same of my own traditions. Where is it in my tradition, thought tradition, that will enable me to think about this? And I went to a guy who I'd started reading many years ago and hadn't really paid that much attention to, but discovered that in Albert Schweitzer's work, there are signals that he's thinking along this way, and it's not surprising. He was a German, he's a dead white German male. Another one. Theologian, philosopher, European-wide renowned player of the pipe organ. Was often to be found crawling around in pipe organs, cleaning the pipes. Who midway through his life and career trained as a physician and up and left Europe, moved to Africa, built a hospital and spent the rest of his life treating diseases in that community, and developed a philosophy of spirituality or spirit that is rooted in the way that Damasio speaks of, in our capacity to live and to manipulate the conditions under which we can stay alive. And he called it, I will to live amongst other wills to live. So he actually developed a whole ethics out of this as well, and he grounded it in this innate kind of irreducible sense that human life wants to live. And we call it a mystery, but not a mystery in the sense that it's kind of hidden from us, but a mystery in the sense that it's irreducible. You can't reduce a human being just to inanimate matter, and you can't reduce a human being to transcendent otherness either. A human person is irreducibly present in this living organism as physiologically as spirit. And he said this: here then is the first spiritual act in human beings' experience, reverence for life. The consequence of it is that they come to realise their dependence upon events quite beyond their control. Therefore they become resigned, and this is the second spiritual act, resignation. What he means by resignation is this profound understanding that my life depends on the flourishing of other lives, or something beyond myself. I'm not in total control of myself. I actually rely on the living environment that I'm in. And this thinking actually goes back to another dead white German male, Friedrich Schleiermacher, a very controversial theologian from the late 1800s, who described faith as the feeling of absolute dependence. And this was very much at the heart of his understanding of Christian spirituality, that is, that human beings are made up of a feeling of dependence and of freedom. In psychological language, how might you describe that for you counsellors? Autonomy?
Sometimes mutuality.
Yeah. Or, mutuality, or maybe attachment. I don't know, we can work that out. And that we're a sort of dynamic interplay between the reliance on other things to keep us alive, but also our sense that we can direct or will make decisions that manipulate our environment. But underlying all that, there is a sort of more ultimate or pervasive feeling, and that is of absolute dependence. There is something ultimately other than me upon which I depend for my life. What does that sound like? It sounds like God. The source of life, the ground of being, upon which I'm utterly dependent, and all things are utterly.
Do you think that's the same motivator then that leads groups to that kind of earth-based, season-focused, fertility, harvest sense of just that recognition of I'm part of the game, but the game's bigger than me, and I want to acknowledge the thing that's bigger than me, that's feeding me and my family, and sometimes wipes in and destroys, and other times seems to preserve. Would you
Oh, absolutely.
say that
Absolutely
sort of
resonant.
sits under there?
Yeah. And I think it's, this is the pre-conscious physiological roots of faith and religion. This is where faith and religion comes from. Rudolf Otto, another dead white German male. It's one of my favourite old books, look at it. He wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy. And in it, he's speaks of this, drawing from Schleiermacher, he speaks of this as the felt sense of the numinous. And he uses numinous, which is a word that just means the spiritual power of a thing, the kind of sense of inherent otherness that fills us with awe at the capacity of something to be other than me. It's kind of a bit difficult to describe. In other words, he also uses the words sense of mysterium tremendum. And he actually says, think of that feeling you get in a horror film when you're scared out of your wits and you kind of enjoy it. Enjoy being out. It's that. We like that feeling because it's, or some of us do, because it touches something in us of that awful awareness of our ultimate dependence on otherness. Now this is roots kind of stuff. This is the pre-conscious kind of stuff. Now, we were talking earlier about Tillich and ultimate concern. Ultimate concern kind of resides down here. Tillich calls it depth, a place of depth in us. And he says it rises up in the content of faith. So, we begin to form thoughts, languages, ideas, and they coalesce into social forms of behaving in this way, which are religious. Now, I'm fully aware that what I'm describing for you is something that's not necessarily standard way of thinking within religious traditions. One of the critiques I've had of this way of thinking is that it is reductionist. It's reducing human spirituality and faith to a physiological reality. What about the transcendent otherness of God that's taking us away from this place into a new reality? And that's a good, solid critique from that tradition's perspective. And I'm, part of being a theologian is to put forward your hypothesis and engage the responses, and have a go at it. And you're theologians, whether you like it or not, or reflective practitioners. There you go. That's Damasio. We're not thinking machines that feel, rather we are feeling machines that think. It's kind of an inversion, isn't it? Because often our religious traditions, our spiritual traditions, are profoundly cerebral and reflective. Even though most of us, ground them in a much deeper experiential source.
And I would just think the people we hold in high regard, even in our Western Christian faith expression, seem to have somehow moved beyond the cerebral and
yes,
live it in a more profound way that we almost admire.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of recognising, and I think in some way that when you're fully living this cerebral thing,
yeah,
it goes beyond the cerebral, and we identify those who do it, and we go, that's commendable and admirable.
Which is why Jesus could say of the Samaritan, if you want to know what eternal life looks like, there it is. Yeah. And it's why Gandhi could say, I believe Jesus' teaching the Sermon on the Mount is the highest teaching known to humankind. And when asked, well, why aren't you a Christian then? His response was, well, I haven't yet found someone who has done it. So there's that, and we respect Gandhi as this amazing person, and we can idealise those sorts of people. If we got close to them, we'd realise they were just like the rest of us, wrestling with the complexities of what it all means, and maybe had the courage to go a bit further than some of us did. But my proposal is that when we are encountering people of other religious faiths, we're not asking ourselves to assent to their religious expressions, to their highly reasoned responses to their own humanness. We're asking ourselves to listen for this stuff. in engaging diversity, we do these little activities that are supposed to sort of simulate engagement with otherness. And one of the things we do that caused all kinds of problems was that we showed a couple of comedy clips, one of which was a comedian who actually had a pretty profound justice message. Comedians are often very angry people. This guy was angry about something that I think would concern most Christians and most other people of faith. His language is, like really confronting. We played this clip. You don't expect to see that sort of thing in a theological college. The question was, are you still able to hear someone when they're swearing in the way he was swearing? Some were, some weren't. Some just got really profoundly offended and got stuck there. That's the kind of thing we're asking of ourselves. When I come across a person here who prays 5 times a day and wears a funny headscarf, there's all these weird sort of attributes of their religion, and I'm coming in at this level, am I able to see, hold and hear this stuff and pay attention to what really is essentially human about the spirit? I reckon it's a great question. How about you? And here's Simone Bay. Isn't she great? A dead white French female.
Excellent.
I'm just switching it up.
Yeah. We're diversity. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Spiritual carers are people who practice paying attention, who listen, who create space for the other, to be the other, to be themselves. They create that space into which the person can come and fill it with themselves and do their own spiritual work, where this sort of stuff can be given expression in the language and the symbol that they have chosen for the time being. And people change, People are allowed to change. In doing this kind of work, they may change, they may not change their external symbols. But regardless of who they are or how they're expressing themselves, the spiritual carer and the counsellor, not dissing counsellors in any way, is paying attention to the core nature of spirituality in that sense. And psychology is getting this. That's why you go into the PsychNet or psych articles and look up spirituality, spiritual care. There's research everywhere on this stuff. People are taking it seriously. And what it is another principle, really. I mentioned irreducibility, particularly in the context of, so let's take hospitalisation for example. You go to hospital, you've got pain in your pancreas area that's driving you, bending you over double, and they've got to keep you in, hydrate you, monitor you for 3 or 4 days. Suddenly you enter a very different space, don't you? You become your symptoms, you become the statistics on your chart, you become your medical notes. It's not that the people who are caring for you don't care for you, they're there because they care. Human beings usually go into those kinds of jobs because they actually want to help somehow, they're helping professions. But the system that we're in is so rationalised that we become reduced, necessarily reduced.
Can I speak in?
Yeah.
Just recently,
Yeah.
I was in the hospital
Yep.
and
Yep.
they were doing a handover and they walked in and said, "This is a bilateral wrist fracture." His name is Shannon.
So they said your
His-
diagnosis
Shannon
first.
has a bilateral wrist fracture. His name is Shannon. And I thought, okay.
You are
Now a
entirely
bilateral-
defined.
Now a bilateral wrist fracture.
Beautiful.
Just to make your point.
Right, a beautiful demonstration of reductionism. You know?
And that was in the ageing unit.
Yeah.
We were talking about the medical model.
Exactly, we
you
did.
know?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it was like that. It's like
Yeah.
you're your broken wrist. You're not
Yeah.
this person.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, and you know, we talked about the way one of the primary functions of the spiritual carer in an environment like that, and this is one of the things that distinguishes spiritual care often from counselling, is that it's in situ. You know, it's not, you don't arrange for a series of meetings or so, and you're often right there in the midst of someone having an experience. And one of the things that we do is see the person as an irreducible mystery, as an irreducible living thing. And that means we see them as Shannon first. We also see them as Shannon who has a wife and 4 kids. Shannon who has a profound interest in counselling, psychology, helping people. Shannon who is afraid. Shannon who's trying to madly work out how to rearrange his schedule now that life's been interrupted. And Raymond Gaita, if you read any book in your journey, read this one, Common Humanity by Raymond Gaita, Melbourne philosopher, wonderful guy. Happens to be an atheist, don't worry about it, it's all okay. Lovely guy. Do you remember the movie or the book Romulus, My Father? No? Okay, don't worry about it. He wrote that. Had an experience as a young man working in a ward for people with incurable neurological disorders and disablements. Witnessed the care of the psychologists and other carers, thought it was amazing, also witnessed some horrendous abuse, but didn't really understand what it meant to truly care for a person until he witnessed a nun come to the ward, one of the wards, and begin to interact with the patients. And he said what was striking about her was the fact that she treated these patients who showed very little of what we would normally attribute as humanness, no value to society, not able to socially interact, couldn't think, couldn't speak, articulate, the sorts of people that some kinds of philosophers would just suggest we do away with them because they're subhuman. This woman, Peter Singer being one of them, this woman seemed to have this innate capacity to treat them as her equals, without condescension. And he realised only when he saw her that all the other amazing carers had been treating the patients with condescension, including himself, almost without thinking. This woman somehow was able to see them as her equals. And he said, you know, it wasn't the fact that she was a great carer that struck him the most. It was the fact that it was when he saw her seeing them, their full humanity was revealed to him. So her way of caring revealed their full humanity to him. It was revelatory in that sense. This is an atheist speaking. It's great, I love it. And that for him and for me has become one of the core understandings of what it means to spiritually care. Can we see the people in our care and be with them in ways that enable others to see their full humanity? That's one of our criteria in terms of measuring whether we're doing this or not. All right. Questions, comments, outrage, anxiousness?
Feeling clearer about it.
Okay, good.
I'm not so.
Have you, is that slide deck up on it?
You'll go up and up today. All right, now, quick cuppa, loo stop, 5 minutes, and then back, and we'll do assessment tasks. And Beth will probably turn up at 4 o'clock.